Okay, so today we're here to pick up right where we left off. What you see on your screen right now is the ATP cycle. That's where you have adenosine triphosphate. You break the bond between the second and third. That releases energy available for cellular work. Then you've got ADP and a regular inorganic phosphate. Well, how do we take the inorganic phosphate, which is 1, and the ADP, which is 2, and stick them back together to make ATP all over again? You need energy from sunlight if you're talking about plants, or from food if you're talking about animals, which is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about this process right here in the green box. That's energy from glucose mainly is going to be used to phosphorylate or put that inorganic phosphate back on ADP to make ATP all over again. So CR, or cell respiration, is what we call that process. And that's a set of all the metabolic reactions that cells use to convert biochemical energy from nutrients that we get from our food to usable ATP. And when we say set, we mean there's more than one. There's multiple cycles and complexes and processes that go into this. So let's begin with cell respiration. Remember that cell respiration is a metabolic pathway. That's a sequence, one after another, of chemical reactions. The products of one are the reactants for the next. The products of that one are the reactants for the next. Just for example, there's numerous metabolic pathways in our bodies. We could check this out. Here's just a few right here. Each of these little circles is a different metabolic pathway. So, multiple options can occur. This could depend on if there's oxygen available or not, if you've got lots of glucose or not very much glucose, if your mitochondria system is under stress, or if there's a whole lot, if it's just easy. So it's more of a choose your own adventure based upon what reactants are available. So you see here just kind of an overview. You see ATP is kind of spit out through glycolysis, through something known as the Krebs, also known as the citric acid cycle, and through the Electron Transport Chain, or ETC. Some things happen out in the cytoplasm, like glycolysis. Other things happen within the mitochondria, like the Krebs and the ETC. Again, you can see the products of this are the reactants for this. The products of this are the reactants of this. So again, it's a metabolic pathway. So let's talk about glycolysis. Right? Remember, glyco, that's another name for glucose. We talked about glycogen before. And lysis means to unbind or loosen or, come apart. So basically, this is a process that breaks down that glucose into products that then go into other processes in our metabolic pathway. Now, doing this actually creates two pyruvates, also known as pyruvic acid molecules. Now, in doing so, we create two ATP molecules. And remember, this occurs out in the cytoplasm. So how do we know where to go from here? Well, that depends on whether or not oxygen is present. So let's talk about oxygen being present first. If that's present within the mitochondria, we are going to go through aerobic respiration. So again, you've got two ATP, you can see here, spit out from glycolysis. That's converting glucose to pyruvic acid. That goes into the mitochondria, which is one of the organelles we talked about a couple months ago. Then through these two pathways, you're going to spit out a total of between 34 to 36 ATP. You see the number published differently in different places. You notice there's 38 total. 2 plus 36 equals 38. Other places say that this is 36 total. Again, it depends on if there's more, how many pyruvates you have, and if you're running at optimal conditions. So there's 36 to 38 ATP that are produced. When oxygen are present, you're going to go through the Krebs cycle and then the electron transport chain. You'll notice that this requires oxygen and glucose, like we've talked about before. Those are the reactants for cell respiration, and it spits out or produces carbon dioxide and water, which we'll talk about in more detail as we go on. So the Krebs cycle is up first. So somewhere between glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, that pyruvate is converted into ACA, or acetyl coenzyme A. Now, we're not going to get into much detail, but its main function is it's a carbon transfer molecule. So you're sticking a bunch of carbons into this, between 4 to 6 to even more carbons, and that enters the Krebs cycle. Why do you want more carbons? Well, they're going to condense with oxaloacetic acid to form citric acid. That's why sometimes, or also known as, aka, you hear the Krebs cycle referred to as the citric acid cycle. So Krebs is a funny word, little background, history meets biology here, but this was first discovered or elucidated, as it were. The first person to shed light on this process within the cells was a guy named Hans Krebs in 1937, hence the Krebs cycle. The main result here is that it produces 2AP, but even though I just said main, more importantly, the byproduct is that it makes loads of hydrogen ions, loads of them. And you'll see why that's important as we go on. But remember, you've got pyruvic acid that's formed through the glycolysis action out in the cytoplasm. That comes into, as it crosses over that mitochondrial membrane, it's converted to ACA or acetyl coenzyme A. That's a lot of extra carbons. Those carbons drive this cycle. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 distinct areas where you're releasing hydrogen ions, which are pretty awesome. Now, you'll see why in a moment. In addition, it's also making 2 ATP molecules. So far, if you're keeping count, we're up to 4. 2 from glycolysis, 2 from the Krebs cycle. You'll also see that this produces carbon dioxide. See the CO2 molecules coming off here? These red things. So this is where the carbon dioxide, when we breathe out, this is where it comes from, is the Krebs cycle. After the Krebs cycle, all of those hydrogen ions I just mentioned, they're actually great because they go into the electron transport chain. The ETC actually makes a ton of ATP. So compared to the 2 from the first 2 processes we talked about, this one makes 34. So now, out of the 38 total that we're producing through each cycle of cell respiration, the vast majority, 34 of those 36 to 38, come from the electron transport chain. As this process moves from one complex to the next, you see complex 1, 2, 3, 4. What it's really doing is establishing a concentration gradient. We talked about this in our last unit. We're establishing a concentration gradient of protons. Sometimes it's called the proton gradient. What makes this important is that these protons, once they're up in this area, on this side of the mitochondrial membrane, they're going to move from high to low concentration through this enzyme or this protein that's embedded in the mitochondrial membrane. Again, note the phospholipid bilayer that's within the mitochondria even. As it moves from high to low concentration through here, this free momentum, it's moving on its own, it's passive transport, but this free momentum operates a molecule called ATP synthase. So synthase stands for, it sounds like synthesize, and basically it takes ADP and a free phosphate, so 2 plus 1, sticks them back together to make ATP all over again. And notice a little lightning bolt in this third bond here, or the bond between the second and the third. That's where that energy comes from. Again, what's the whole point behind this? We want to regenerate ATP. That way we can break those bonds all over again. In doing so, you're going to have energy to drive cell work. The last thing is that this also releases a lot of water. You've got to have, a balanced circuit, so to speak. So it's kind of like a ground. You can't have just free electrons roaming around. So the oxygen you breathe in, it actually comes into play here with the electron transport chain because that oxygen is that final electron carrier. So a couple free hydrogen ions bond with a couple, electrons to oxygen. Next thing you know, you get H2O and you're releasing water at the same time. So that carbon dioxide that's spit out through Krebs, the water that we breathe out, that's released through the electron transport chain. So as a quick overview, we've got a chemical reaction to sum all this up. Glucose plus oxygen, this arrow is one way, so it's a one-direction reaction. It yields carbon dioxide and water. Keep in mind that these are the reactants, these are the products. C6H12O6 plus 6 oxygens yields 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters. Again, you make 2 ATP here. As you move through that mitochondrial membrane, it becomes ACA, that's that carbon carrier. That drives the citric acid cycle, which releases 2 ATP as well. Now we're up to 4 total. In doing so, it also generates tons of hydrogen ions or protons that are going to drive that gradient, that proton gradient that operates the electron transport chain. This creates the most, between 32 and 34, depending on where you're looking and the optimal conditions, the most ATP. So you can see that this is far more efficient than our next pathway we're going to talk about. When the oxygen's present, you could actually drive these processes, whereas without oxygen or anaerobic respiration, you're going to make far fewer ATP. Keep in mind that you're going to make between 36 and 38 through aerobic respiration in the mitochondrial matrix. Anaerobic respiration. As I just alluded to, this is when there is, see here, no available oxygen. There's 2 types or 2 pathways, right? It just depends on where you're at. There's lactic acid fermentation. That's animal cells do this, especially muscle cells. That's whenever you're, maybe you're operating, we'll do this in class, when you're operating a certain muscle for a while and you can't get oxygen there quickly enough, right? What that's doing is releasing 2 ATP at a time, but it also is releasing lactic acid as a byproduct. And the buildup of that in your cells is going to cause your muscles to burn or cramp up. So that's out this way. This creates 2 ATP. You've also got ethanol fermentation, which is what's used to make bread, wine, beer, things like that. That's plants and fungus, as in yeast, and that makes ethanol or alcohol as a byproduct. This way also produces 2 ATP. So let's do a quick account. You've got aerobic respiration, which makes 2 plus 2 plus 34, or a total of 38 ATP, whereas anaerobic respiration makes 2 plus 2, or only 4 ATP total. So you can see how aerobic is far more efficient because every time you go through that metabolic pathway, you're creating way more, up to 32 to 34 more ATP every cycle versus what you're doing in anaerobic respiration. So just to overview, glycolysis, you're making 2 ATP. When oxygen's present, remember that determines the next step. You're going to go through the Krebs and the ETC cycles or chains, and now you've got 2 plus 34, you're up to 38 ATP total. You still go through glycolysis, but without oxygen or no O2, you're only making 2 additional ATP. So that's not really enough for really complex organisms to survive on. All right, we can use anaerobic respiration as a fallback for short instances of time, but we can't survive on that for very long at all. We'll illustrate that in class just through a few examples. Bacteria, on the other hand, and other things that are simple-celled or single-celled, they can survive on anaerobic pathways alone. They don't need near as much ATP. They don't have the multitude of cells that eukaryotic organisms have. So again, here's just kind of sums it all up. So next time, as you can see, we'll talk about photosynthesis. Can't wait.